So you hit on a number, in the last few minutes, you hit on a number of different planning strategies relating to these particular assets. From a bigger picture perspective, if you have a person who is thinking they're going to need to qualify for, and need long-term care services in the relatively near future, what are some other just general strategies that you like as far as how someone can spend down some assets and try to qualify a little bit sooner?
There's a couple, again, some of it, as I mentioned, like looking at the real property, that's kind of an issue that comes up. So it really depends on the circumstances, but a couple of others that I always look at is, are there prepaid burial plans? Because they can buy one for both spouses if they're married. So that's a good option to have those prepaid burial plans and purchasing those. One of another would be vehicle, because and actually in Idaho, which it's kind of an interesting thing the way this happened, because it was almost like it was because of the way the computer program worked for food stamps that it kind of carried over, but they actually exclude 2 vehicles if it's a married couple. So one for each individual can be excluded. So sometimes that can be an advantage in saying, hey, we need to update these. They're old, they're not very reliable. Let's go ahead and buy a new vehicle. I mean, obviously vehicles are depreciate, and so it's always not a great thing, but it's really looking at the situation and saying, this would be of benefit, then let's go ahead and buy something that's going to work better for them. So that's an option, because those are excluded. A couple of others, sometimes an irrevocable immediate annuity can be an option. I don't always use those a lot, but I do on occasion where that can be very helpful in kind of making things, and really what you're doing is taking some cash assets, and it makes the most sense when we're dealing with a married couple, where we can put those in this annuity that's now going to pay a monthly annuity payment to that spouse. And again, it's because that's income to them. We're really looking at it and looking at those income rules and making sure that it's going to create enough income for them that it really justifies making that kind of a change too. So that's a good option that really can be helpful too. I think it's sometimes, and I've had situations where we're looking and they've got credit card debt or something, or even a mortgage that, paying that down or doing some of those things is also a very good way, because really the goal is to not just spend the money down, but I like to call it reposition the assets to some degree, put them into excluded resources that are going to benefit, especially the community spouse. When we're dealing with a single individual, a lot of these things, there's not as many options. And really it's almost just spending it down and, again, doing a few things that will benefit, like a prepaid burial plan, because we want to make sure that's taken care of. But a lot of it is when we're dealing with a married couple, we're trying to reposition that to be of the greatest benefit to that spouse who's still in the community, so that he or she has the most benefit of those assets as we can possibly make. So that's kind of the goal, I guess.
That makes sense. And it seems like a recurring theme with everything we're talking about here is there's a lot of misconceptions out there about Medicaid, partly because it's very complicated, and partly because a lot of people who work in these fields with people in this age group just tend to not have a lot of insight or a lot of experience with it. And so you regularly hear people say things like, I'll never qualify. That's only for poor people, or if I qualify for Medicaid, I'll only end up in the worst nursing homes, or I won't be able to find one. I mean, is there any truth to any of these things, or is this basically just misinformation?
Generally misinformation. It's interesting, because I have those calls where they say, well, I have too much money. And I say, well, let's look at what you have. And it's amazing how many times when we start going through it and I tell them, oh, well, your IRA is actually excluded. And they're like, oh, and that's, and so it changes the whole picture at that point, and from what they thought was the case. Right. Again, because they assume they've got to be poor before they can get it. But and I didn't even, this is kind of going back to one of the planning tools, but sometimes when individuals have, and I run into this because I'm in a rural community with farmers who their Social Security income is really low, but a lot of times they have assets because they own this land and they've sold it and whatever. But doing an upward revision of the resource allowance, I've been able to keep $300,000 or $400,000 of resources sometimes for the community spouse by going through that process. So again, until you look at the facts, maybe they can have a lot more than what they even thought was possible. The other, there is, and I do have, people say, well, I won't have as good a room. And it's true that Medicaid generally only provides for a semi-private room. And so that's, in the nursing homes, that's not as big of an issue. And even if, I have many times that they'll still be in a private room, even though just because there's not, they're not at capacity or something like that. So I don't think in the nursing home, there's a lot of difference in the treatment. When we move to assisted living facilities, there is a little bit of an issue because there's some of the assisted living facilities that just simply do not accept Medicaid. And they just say that right up front. And many of the others only take so many Medicaid patients. And part of that, the way that Idaho pays assisted living facilities is really poor. And we've kind of talked about it. They said, well, that's the way the waiver was written and we can't change it. But the amount that they pay is so low that most of them will only accept Medicaid. There's two situations. Sometimes when they've been in the facility and paid privately for a number of years, so they kind of feel like, oh, well, we want to keep them, so we'll accept it. Or they're in a semi-private room, and that's almost the only way that the assisted living facilities will accept it, just because Medicaid pays so poorly. And that is a problem in Idaho with the assisted living facilities, and so sometimes that can be a little bit of an issue. Do they get as good a care? Yes, but it's just the living arrangement might not be as good as it would be. They can pay for a private room if they want, but usually, it can be, sometimes that fee to have a private room might be anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000, and so unless there's somebody that has money to pay that amount, it's not, it's not very likely that will happen.
And what are they even really paying for when you're in assisted living? Because my understanding is they're not actually paying the room and board, right? They're paying for the additional services you're receiving, the personal care and the medical care that you're receiving, right?
Right, and that is because the assisted living has kind of a base rate, which is and then they have their rates go up based on the level of care and how much care you need. And of course, because of those level of care requirements for Medicaid, most of the time the ones who are receiving Medicaid have a little bit higher needs in the assisted living, so the cost's a little higher, and so that's what makes it a little bit more complicated in dealing with that. And yet Medicaid doesn't. They're daily, because it comes out with a daily rate, and a lot of times I hardly ever see it very high, and so it's it makes it really tough on those assisted living facilities to try to make it work. So